How many of you have heard the phrase, keep Austin weird? Right, everybody. How many of you have a t-shirt or a bumper sticker that says, keep Austin weird, or some variation? Right. How many of you know the story of Keep Austin Weird, the background of it? A few people, not many. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a different story that maybe you haven't heard of before. And it begins with the word weird, right? The actual etymology of weird goes back hundreds of years. And it really means looking toward the future. It means things that are to come, portents of things to come. So keep Austin weird actually means keep Austin future-oriented. And so let's keep that in mind as we think about keep Austin weird and how we respond to it. Austin should be, by definition, by our slogan, a future-oriented city. And there's a deep history to this that I want to share with you that I discovered, again, that maybe you haven't heard about before. And it begins with our springs, right? Austin is known for its springs, Barton Springs. The native people here thought that the springs could actually tell the future, that they were an oracle of things to come. You would consult these springs. So that's a kind of fascinating history to it. And it goes back to Barton Springs. So there was this group that got together every so often at Barton Springs, and they were called the Club of Weird, W-Y-R-D. And their mission, their purpose was to imagine and reimagine visions for Austin's future. So that was their goal. That was their purpose for doing that. And it's a really unusual thing to publicly imagine together as a practice, right? So that goes way back. And it was open to anyone. So anyone with a feeling, a yearning for the future, we call einglatsan, which, if you can see here, is nostalgia spelled backwards, right? People who had a yearning for the future, a yearning for things to come, they would get together and imagine together at the springs, and they would, of course, drink and do everything that's have music, very Austin kind of vibe to this. And when you felt the spirit, you would perform, sing, tell about your vision for the future of Austin. So fascinating history. I'm not sure if you know about it. They also used to communicate in weird, esoteric ways using street art, what we would call graffiti now, and that tradition maybe has remained in Austin, this sort of strange, esoteric street art that goes back to the Club of Weird. Another really fascinating bit to this story is that Bob Kane in the 30s was visiting Austin, and when they would call a meeting, this is not a bat signal, this is a W for weird. So this is how they would gather together. So Bob Kane, the creator of Batman, incorporated this idea into the bat signal. Another known fact you might not have known. So this went on for a while, and as Austin developed, this kind of, I would call it underground, but it was really open to anyone. This civic imagination practice that existed here grew over time, and in the mid-40s or so, it was incorporated into the city as something called the Office of the Weird. And you may have your own favorite stories. Leslie, one of our favorite weirdos in Austin, used to go to those meetings as well, and maybe you've visited them and seen some of these or attended some of these yourself. So the Office of the Weird, a little known, they have briefings with the mayor about once a month, and you can ask Mayor Adler, but I'm sure he might deny that it exists. And really to express this view, not to really try to understand practical outcomes or strategies, but really a visioning process, really a way to add material and democratize the visioning of Austin together, and doing that in a public way. So, given that story, I'm curious how many of you would want to attend a Office of the Weird meeting? How many of you have einglatsan? Cool. Okay, that's great. A lot of you there. So, the fun part about this is the next meeting of the Office of the Weird will be its first. Because maybe some of you figured this out, but that is not a real story. I made that up. But I want it to exist. So as Harry Truman says, the only new thing in the world is a history you don't know, or maybe the futures we haven't imagined yet. So this talk, I have two purposes. One is to really talk about how stories, how experiences change our relationship to the future and possible futures. And the second is to actually call into being this thing called the Office of the Weird. So I want to make it happen today. And my goal is for this TED Talk to be the first one to actually end up with an outcome of having a government agency created out of that. So I'm hoping that might happen, and I'm going to do my best to do it. So the first point, thinking about the future. We all do it. It's one of the defining features of people. That's what we do. We're kind of prediction machines, as it were. That's how our brains work. But we think about the future using a lot of the same parts of our brain as we do to recall the past. So we need the past. We need past experience in order to make different futures thinkable, which is great. That's how it happens. We have to rely on our history, the things that we've experienced, and we can expand upon them. But when the world is changing very quickly, when we have nonlinear kinds of changes, accelerating kinds of changes, the past is not always a great predictor of the future. And so we have to artificially create new images of the future. We have to actively retune our neurons to what's possible. And to do that actively, do that inside our own minds, but then together, civically, so that we can imagine different kinds of futures and different kinds of outcomes, and not be stuck in someone else's vision, a used future that we are inheriting, but something that we create together. And I think Austin is the perfect place to imagine the weirdest possible futures. And the psychology of futures thinking is really interesting, beyond the scope to go in deeply in this talk, but it's really, one of the things that I find fascinating is the mental health aspects of it, is that depressed people are defined less by their past trauma or something that's happened to them, and more by their inability, now they're related, but inability to imagine better futures, and they overestimate risk. So depression, in a way, is a future thinking disease, as it were. And we don't want to be like this, right? We don't want to be disempowered. So part of my job as an experiential futurist and a futurist is to empower people, individuals, groups, organizations to have some purchase on making better futures, to be better architects of the future. And as Mohsen Hamid says, stories have the power to liberate us from the tyranny of what was and what is. So stories are very powerful technologies that we have created to allow us to make better futures. And my argument here is that in order to make new futures thinkable and actionable, we have to intentionally create, design, and unleash a wide range of possible futures into the present. We have to actively do that. And we have to make those possible futures full-bodied experiences. So we want to create an emotional connection to the future, a physical experience of that, so we make artifacts, tangible media to do that. And that's what we call, my colleague, longtime colleague Stuart Candy and I started calling this experiential futures. So not just thinking about the future in the abstract, which it always is, the future doesn't exist, but to try to, as much as we can, again, artificially, but with a purpose, to make the future tangible, to have a connection to that, and to experience possible futures, and to embed that in our bodies. So some examples of work that I've done in the past. This was a project with the Hawaii 2050 Sustainability Task Force in Hawaii, and we created 4 different versions of Hawaii in the year 2050. And a couple here. On the upper right, upper left, sorry, is a kind of high growth future, and we staged it as a debate between 2 candidates for governor. But those candidates were actually corporations who, as legal persons in this future, could run directly. They didn't have to pay some politician off. They just ran as corporations, ran as legal persons. This was before Citizens United, by the way, so I think our timeline might be even shorter, unfortunately, depending on how you think about it. But through the debate, we were able to elucidate a lot of the issues that were happening in Hawaii in that high growth future, a lot of massive population growth, those kind of issues that were happening, environmental issues. So one candidate was a gaming and design company called Kobayashi Virtual Concern. The other one was a nuclear energy and water company, kind of the incumbent. So you can see the dynamics, how that played out. On the bottom right is another future, simultaneously held. We divided the 500 people into different groups. And that one was an independent military dictatorship of Hawaii. It was a sovereign Hawaii, separated from the US, but run as a dictatorship. But people came in and they were cast as climate refugees from flooded islands in the Pacific. So you came in and you took an oath and you understood that now you're a citizen soldier in this world. And so you can see how the performance, we created the military uniform of Hawaii in 2050. We had videos, we had oaths. So it's a very participatory, active experience of these kinds of futures. And once you experience a few of these, your mind, hopefully, is open to seeing different sets of possibilities, what you like and dislike, and then responding to that appropriately. Another example is we did this for World Oceans Day in 2010, and we were looking at plastic ocean pollution. So as I mentioned, I lived in Hawaii. We would see these tides of plastic bits come into these beautiful beaches. So I was thinking a lot about the Pacific Gyre, now it's relatively well known, and how do we communicate that to an audience? This is at the California Academy of Sciences. How do we show that in a way that's not just, hey, there's a lot of plastic in the ocean, it's really doing some damage. So what we tried to do, or what we did, was create an experience, an invitation to think about how that is part of our whole system, that we're part of that system, the Pacific, we're all connected. And we did that through 4 different drinking vessels that correlated to 4 different periods in time. One was 1910, one was 1960, one was 2010, and one was 2030. And we put the relative amounts of ocean plastic in each one of those. And so 1910 had very little. That was the beginning of industrial plastic. But by 2030, you can see how gross it is. Now, the fun part, the experiential part of this, was that we were drinking out of these, and it was gross, right? There's like film canisters and balloons and pantyhose and gross stuff in there. But our little trick was that the bottom part, the ceramic part, was separated from the top. So it had water in it. We could drink it, but it wasn't actually connected to that. So that picture, that woman's face of wonder and disgust, is what we were trying to elucidate, to bring out, to create that kind of connection to that an emotional, physical connection to the Pacific Gyre, something way out in the ocean, and to understand that we're part of the same system. So that was our technique for doing that, to use disgust as a tool for understanding a futures issue. And then another project that I did was to create a mayor's office in the city of Newport in the year 2061. So I won't go into great detail here, but all of these little artifacts were creations that tell a bit of the story, right? So right on the left, there's a flag there, and it's a 48-star flag, because in this future, 2061, Texas and Hawaii had seceded from the Union, but the rest had remained, right? It's pretty plausible now. So every one of these little details, every one of these artifacts has a detail and tells a story. So we think about these things as artifacts, like an archaeologist would think about it. Each thing has to have a world that made it possible to exist in. And so it creates a different kind of relationship, as opposed to reading a report about the future or even watching a movie in certain cases. You're involved in the creation of that world. And this is not my project, but I put it up here to show the power of this kind of experience of different futures. This is a project called Vision, Not Victims, and it worked with Syrian youth in refugee camps to have them dress up as the future career that they want to embody and have. So a doctor or an astronaut, and really to empower, to change the narrative of their own lives, their own future lives, and to feel that, okay, yeah, it's a little bit more real if I can see myself in that. I mean, these are psychological known tricks that we play so that we can embody the kind of future that we want to be. So the Office of the Weird, I would like for that, for us to remember today as the start of something that's 150 years old, and to create it together and to make it happen. I think we need a platform for imagining the future together. We do it in different ways, or we borrow other people's future. I think we need a civic movement to create weird and wonderful futures. To do it in Austin, it should start here. I think we should live a great story, and I think we should live and create a weird story too, together. Thanks.